Okay, let's get started. Welcome to week 2, lecture 2 of Immersive Game Level Design. Hopefully you are aware that this week is a little bit of a different week because there is currently a lockdown. This lecture is therefore being delivered in an online format, that being a YouTube Premiere video. I mean, if you're watching this now, you obviously know that. But if not, and you're still catching up, then that is why it's being delivered in this format. Now, I should mention that at the moment, this is, again, a temporary measure. Hopefully, by this time next week, we have returned back to, in quotes, normal. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. This isn't the normal way things were intended for this semester, and it may not be the format that we continue with in the near future. So, this is just for this week only. Speaking of this week we are going to be talking about ProBuilder in a much larger level of detail. Also keep in mind that there is a checkpoint for assignment 1, that being part A. You do have a checkpoint in your workshop, which your tutor will be checking up with you. The workshop is also about ProBuilder, and we're going to get you started on whiteboxing your level. Now, because Monday classes, i.e. this lecture day as well, have been cancelled, the Monday students who would go into the practicals just after the lecture, we're encouraging you to attend any of the Tuesday workshops. So I sent an announcement out for that. Make sure you check that as well if you have not. So for the Monday students, you have the option of entering any of those classes, and we'll mark you off happily there. Just make yourself known. Make sure the tutor is aware, because they may not even know that you're in the Discord chat at the time. It'll be a Discord online session. So do that. For the other students, it's just a normal class. Attend your normal workshop and get your assignment 1 part A checkpoint marked off as well. You'll have to promote yourself and say, hey, I'm ready, I can get my stuff marked off, because we may not necessarily have the time or clarity to kind of go through everyone, because people will be jumping in and out, and you know how Discord works. It's a little bit chaotic. So just keep that in mind. That's what's coming up, and yeah, let's get started directly into today's work. So this lecture will act as a more formal introduction to assignment 1. I know last week I did talk about it just a little bit, but this week will be more of a, I guess, justification for certain things and a little bit more clarity on certain parts of assignment 1. So once again, assignment 1 is a prototype level design. You are not actually making a fully complete level. You're making a level that's just a little bit beyond what we would call a white boxed level. White box level being a level that is just mostly consisting of simple blocks and simple bits of geometry that would typically just have the default texture applied to them, i.e. a white or a grey texture. So assignment 1 is a little bit beyond that. There will be some very simple texturing and some very simple lighting associated with your submission, and we'll walk you through all of that in the next few weeks. So assignment 1, once again, it's an individual assignment. It's worth 30%. There are 2 parts of it, part A and part B. You can find more information about this in the CRA on Blackboard, so definitely check that out. Now this is due in week 6 by 11 p.m. on the Friday. So not due at midnight, it's at 11 p.m. you need to hand this in by. So what is the level exactly? First of all, it is a competitive multiplayer FPS level. The theme of the level, as in the game that it is focused on, is Overwatch, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. And once again, it's a prototype standard. You're not actually supposed to bring this thing to full completion, which makes sense because we don't have the actual Overwatch design toolkit. So we're not using that, we're using Unity, so it's impossible to anyway. So we're only getting it to a point of, say, alpha stage testing would be the next thing that we would do. Once again, because it's a white box level, or just a little tiny bit beyond white box, it's very low polygonal level geometry in nature. And it only includes basic texturing and lighting. We will have a couple of workshops around simple triggers and pickups too, so that you can have certain placeholder elements showing that, yes, this is a pickup, yes, this is something that you need to activate, this is a door that you need to press E on, that kind of thing. Not that some of those exist in Overwatch, but we will show you them anyway. And the real point of this is that you showcase your level design theory and understanding of introductory Unity and ProBuilder skills learned in both lectures and workshops. So just to articulate that a little bit better, you will demonstrate bits of theory from lectures, that being formal elements, ProBuilder techniques, contextual theory, and a little bit towards the end and closer to submission, multiplayer and esports level design. So I think that's in like week 5? Yeah. From workshops, you will demonstrate technical skills such as ProBuilder, first and foremost, a little bit of geometry manipulation, which is, I mean, that's relevant to ProBuilder, but it is a little bit more applicable to 3D programs in general. A small bit of texture mapping, and a lot of this just relates to Unity and using a tool properly, so it's not overly complicated at all. As well as your understanding of, say, setting up triggers, events, a little tiny bit of scripting, that kind of thing. And that's more relevant to just straight up game design than it is to using, say, ProBuilder. Once again, small step beyond whiteboxing. So it's not fully complete level, it's not whiteboxing, it's just the next stage beyond whiteboxing. I'm sure that has a name, but I'm just going to call it that. So the level should be geometrically complex and detailed enough to portray the concept, but not excessively so. Once we get the idea across and see, oh right, that's a staircase, then that's it. You don't need to work on that bit of geometry anymore. If it doesn't look like what it should look like, then it should at least look like that. Yeah. Some assignment 1 tips. Some of these are kind of, I don't know, very straightforward, let's put it that way. So assignment 1 tip, seriously, start from a top-down diagram. So in the past, we have encouraged students to start from a top-down diagram. This time around, we are actually, I wouldn't say forcing you to, because, I mean, you don't have to, but we are making it so that it's part of the marks, at least. So if you don't do it, as in this is your first assignment 1 part A checkpoint, then you just don't get marked for it. So it's within your interest to start from a top-down diagram. And mostly because it helps so much with getting that initial layout down, the initial scale of things, which we'll also talk about in this week's workshop. That's very important because you're scaling it towards a character controller in first person. So you need to do this at some point anyway. So yeah, start from a top-down diagram. If you have still not drawn your top-down diagram or not locked in, 20% of it at this point, do that. It will seriously help with articulating at least the first part of your level if you're still working at that stage of it. Now this one is just silly, but in the past we have had a few students that didn't submit a level, they just submitted a concept for a level, as in, so I will explain this. This assignment used to be a presentation. But in the presentation, you needed to present the level that you created. But some students didn't realize that they needed to create a level. I don't know how that's possible. We spent 6 weeks working on a level, and yeah. But that shouldn't happen with this iteration of it. But if you are walking down to assignment 1 submission and you don't have a level, you were doing the assignment incorrectly. You actually do need to make a level for this assignment. Please make a level. So it's a little bit of an older tip, but I think it still applies. Just please do the assignment if you want to get the actual marks for the assignment. Don't submit a level design document for this assignment. That's the next assignment, so really don't confuse the two. For assignment 1, you don't actually need to focus heavily on narrative elements at all. Like, there are no marks associated with that. There are lots of marks associated with it in assignment 2 and 3. So if you are thinking, I want to weave my grand narrative for this assignment, just hold off for a couple of weeks, or a few weeks, because you will have that opportunity. Really just focus on getting those ProBuilder skills in and some of those formal elements from both lectures and workshops in the first few weeks in instead. So not yet. Super big tip, do not make a dark level. It is so hard to mark something that you just cannot see and articulate well. The way we're remedying this is that we're, first of all, encouraging you to make an Overwatch level, which are rarely dark. I mean, the King's Row, I guess, scene can be a little bit dark, but even that is lit by lots of lights. And the simple fact that we're asking you to do a small amount of lighting means that you should be avoiding this issue already. But yeah, don't make a dark level. It's really hard to understand what you're aiming for if your level is just in the dark. We can't see what the heck we're looking at half the time. And once again, you do not need to work on complex game mechanics. Now, I will say later that you do not need to implement Overwatch mechanics. I've said this a number of times. I will continue saying it until submission. But if you find yourself, I don't know, what's a good example for the game that we're focusing on is if you're implementing a weapon. No, you've gone too far. That's not level design. Stop. So yes, you do not need to work on complex game mechanics. We will give you an FPS character controller. It doesn't have a weapon, but you can move and jump around with it. That should be enough. Everything else we will show you how to do. And if anything is you think needs to be added beyond that, I guess have a chat with your workshop tutor, but they will essentially be saying the same thing. Just work on the level, please. Okay. Once again, and I'll keep reminding people of this because I know some people, let's say, didn't watch the first lecture and are just finding out this week that there are bits and pieces of your workshops that actually get marked. So if you're one of those students, you need to quickly go and do last week's workshop. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on 2% this week. So if you decided to take a break last week, you're already 2% behind on your entire grade. So assignment 1 part A is actually marked during your first 5 workshops. There's 10% total that you will accumulate for part A. Once again, this week's workshop marks will essentially equate to specific tasks completed from last week's workshop. So we're not really getting you to, we're not just marking last week's workshop because there's a whole heap of stuff there. We're basically saying like, look, at the end of the day, focus on these couple of things and show us how that comes out the following week. And I'm going to be real with you, mark allocation for that is quite straightforward. If you do something, you will get the marks. This is going to repeat for the first 6 weeks. So hopefully this model is clear. And once again, if this is news to you, then you have some catching up to do. The workshop time, as in your allocated workshop time, or prior, and I'll explain that in a second, is the only time these tasks will be marked off. You're not going to send us an email on Friday saying, hey, I finally finished my workshop tasks from the week before, give me my 2%. No, if you miss your workshop, you've missed the marks. The only ways around this is if, let's say you can't attend your workshop, okay, that's fine, that happens. Sometimes you get sick. Sometimes you have emergency work or whatever else is going on. Then you can send an email to your workshop tutor saying, hey, look, I can't attend my workshop, but here's the work beforehand. And we'll leave it up to you to demonstrate that. Maybe just a few screenshots, a document, that kind of thing. So you have the capacity to send us the work prior to the workshop, but definitely not after. I'm being very strict on this because I want students to stay on track. Weirdly, this unit has this problem of students deciding that they'll do this assignment at the last minute. It does not work out. So we are fixing that this year. And again, this will repeat for the next 5 weeks until full submission. So hopefully this model is clear to you. Some information about the current progress of assignment 1. So once again, it's a competitive FPS level for Overwatch. You're making it for Assault, Escort, Capture Point, Deathmatch. And hybrid. I left that out in the lecture and even my workshop, is that there are maps in Overwatch that are actually a combination of the two. Specifically something like capture point and escort would be a good definition of that. And last week's workshop, we had a really good discussion on the game mechanics, not just of Overwatch, but an example map, that being Hanamura, which is a capture point map. We talked about the theme and aesthetics of specifically this level. We talked about the gameplay and flow of not just Overwatch maps in general, but Hanamura, because Hanamura has some interesting elements about this map that can, for example, make some frustration occur around certain choke points. And we also heavily explored the top-down diagrams of this level, both the initial ones and, let's say, a completed one that they took from 3D, as well as some early stage white boxing. So that was a really good discussion. I'm quite happy with how that went. I think the students, specifically, let's say in my class, did get some really cool information from there, some really useful information from there. And the other thing I will say is that some of you are really knowledgeable on Overwatch to begin with, which is excellent, amazing. I have seen some of the stuff that you're posting on Discord, which is great to see. So, and I will address this in the very next slide, I'm glad we picked Overwatch, but there is something I do need to say about us picking Overwatch for the moment. So, I'll get to that soon. Week 1. The workshop was on top-down diagrams. I guess the feedback that we can say from that is that a large chunk of them look really amazing. We're really excited to see what you're going to do with that. Some of you have some crazy ideas, man. Not going to lie. Not bad ones, by the way. They look great. I think they'll work. Yeah, we're really interested to see what you do with this. So great job there. And the other thing is that if you're in a normal workshop, but you still feel like getting some feedback from the people on Discord, because the Discord isn't just for the Discord workshop that we run in the final session on a Tuesday, feel free to post some of your examples there too, because that could start a discussion between classes. However, except for this week's Monday class, you do need to attend your normal workshop as per normal. Online or in person, doesn't matter. Okay, so about Activision Blizzard. Now, I kind of addressed this a little bit in week 1. I didn't really want to go into too much detail because I don't like jumping the gun on these kind of things, because sometimes they can be not what you initially think they are. But yeah, let's address the elephant in the room for this semester, I guess, specifically for assignment 1. So Blizzard is currently facing a pretty serious lawsuit by the looks of it. And we recognize that some students and even staff are not super big fans of them presently. And I say staff because I'm going to keep it real here. I have not necessarily been the biggest fan of Blizzard games for the last 3 years for my own personal reasons. Like, I play a lot of Diablo 3. The next game after that would probably be WoW. As a games designer and programmer, I get very frustrated with their, I would say, design decisions, but I would also say lack thereof design decisions in many areas. So I've been disappointed with Activision Blizzard for a little bit of time. They used to be an amazing, awesome company. I won't get into that. Like, it's a little bit, that's not what the point of this slide is about. So what I will say is that the content gets locked really early before a semester starts. So this lawsuit that they have is really bad timing. We know that some students are not huge fans of them right now. Some of you may even be leaning towards the whole boycotting thing, which we can understand. However, I think we just need to say directly that we're still going to make a prototype level for Overwatch. However, keep in mind that it is a prototype level and not a level that will ever be published or completed. So if you are thinking in the 11th hour, post-submission at least, that you want to instead make your level for Valorant or Counter-Strike, I'm not allowing it for the level submission. You need to do it for Overwatch. But after submission, you're free to do whatever you want with your level. And you may say, hey, I spent 90% of development time developing it for Overwatch, but towards the end, I'm going to release it for something else because of these kind of reasons. That's okay. Because basically that's not something we care about as well. So you're free to do that. So because it's a prototype level, you do have creative freedom on what you would actually like it to look like in the end. And I know I've had a chat with at least some people in my class about the idea of, making it for kind of an Overwatch game, but also the game that they have in mind simultaneously. I think that works. If you want to make a Valorant-themed Overwatch level, just as an example, yeah, do that. I mean, maybe that's a nice in-between. The other thing I want to say about that is that, while we're studying the level design for Overwatch, these levels were created by real people, small teams of people, like 3 or 4 individual staff members, not by Blizzard literally itself. People employed by Blizzard. So their creative work is what we're really looking at here. So just keep that in mind. There's a little bit of a difference between the two. So yeah, hopefully that clears some things up there. I know some students are a little bit weird about the topic. If you do have any concerns, just have a chat with us and we can maybe find a nice in-between for you there. So, let's get to the meat of the matter, which is the whole point of this lecture. Let's talk about some ProBuilder, specifically its integration into Unity. So, let's recap. ProBuilder. What the heck is ProBuilder? It's a free, lightweight 3D modeling plugin for Unity. Hopefully by now you have understood that you actually need to download this. This is not something that is baked into Unity by default. The way you access this now, it's no longer through the asset store. You actually need to get it via what's called the package manager. So the package manager replaced the asset store a couple of Unity versions ago. I'm actually not a big fan of the package manager. I think it's a little bit clumsy and it's not as interactive when you download stuff for Unity. I think they should try and go back to the asset store. Anyway, so package manager, there are some workshop instructions, so if you're confused about what the heck I'm talking about, just check out the workshop, which will be released very soon, probably straight after this. Acquire it that way. If that doesn't work, just look literally for ProBuilder on the asset store, funnily enough, and you will have the option to install it via package manager. It's really weird what they're doing, so yeah. So with regards to ProBuilder, you are expected to learn ProBuilder and not use an alternate 3D modeling program. So in the CRA for assignment 1, I mentioned this. This is part of the frequently asked questions. Hey, I'm really good at Maya or 3ds Max or even Blender. Can I just use that instead? No, you are being marked on your capacity to use ProBuilder. And to a lesser extent, Unity. So think of it more as make this in Unity with ProBuilder, and don't make this in Blender without ProBuilder, if that makes sense. Don't make this in another game engine or 3D engine. So there is an introductory video on Blackboard. Keep in mind that I made this a few years ago, so there are some bits and pieces of that are a little bit out of date. But for the most part, it's a good introductory video. I would have normally played it like right now if we were in a lecture theatre. But because I don't have access to a high quality version of this, like I'm not going to just play the YouTube version because their compression sucks. Just watch it, like literally pause it, watch this other video, and come back to the lecture if you're watching this in your spare time. But it's basically just going to go over everything that I'm going to cover anyway. So yeah, let's do that. You do whatever you want. I'm going to keep going. Now there are some ProBuilder limitations. First of all, we are using ProBuilder to create static 3D geometry and apply textures to it. That's really the whole point of us using ProBuilder. We just need a nice tool that we can set up some simple geometric elements that are beyond a cube, so something that we can use to extrude surfaces with is probably 90% of ProBuilder's use. and slap some textures on it, because after that, Unity does the rest. It does the lighting, it does the normal mapping, it handles materials. Yeah, ProBuilder is just, think of it as mostly a geometric extrusion tool that works very well. So having said that, it is not a tool suitable for, say for example, articulated decorations and doodads. So let's say that you have something that's a little bit more in the vein of a decoration. I think I used the example of a chandelier last week. If you're trying to make that, that's not a level design element. That's something you download off the asset store and just throw in, right? That's not important to what we care about for this unit. If you find yourself making something like that, or even something like, I don't know, a table. A table is pretty simple, but if you find yourself making that, something that doesn't even need to be in the scene or could potentially be destroyed, you know, that's not necessarily what the tool is for. I will allow you to get away with using other assets there, specifically for assignment 1. I mean, you shouldn't even have these things in assignment 1 to begin with. So just, there isn't really a red line where you go from one to the other, because some things can be both. But just keep in mind, if you're making something that's very geometrically complex that has no relevance to gameplay within the level, maybe don't use ProBuilder for that. Or don't do it at all, would be my recommendation. If you're trying to make an avatar or an NPC with ProBuilder, seriously, I mean, I have seen someone do it, because at the end of the day, you could export the thing that you've made in ProBuilder to another tool to then manipulate further. But just, it's a level design tool. Don't make an avatar or an NPC if you can avoid it. You don't create textures with ProBuilder. You import them into Unity, you manipulate them using the material settings, and you apply them using ProBuilder. So we're not creating textures. Weight painting, rigging, yeah, obviously not. And dynamic mesh deformation, it has zero elements related to that at all. I mean, I'd use a shader personally, but yeah, don't even think in that vein. And the thing is that the vast majority of these we're actually not doing or even really focusing on in IGB321 anyways. So this is a nice short list of things that you don't need to worry about or be trying to do with ProBuilder. Some of them we will kind of look into, but it's not the point of the tool. So when you install ProBuilder, you may have literally nothing appear. If that's the case, you need to enable the UI by going to Tools, ProBuilder, ProBuilder Window. And again, the workshop will show you how to do this. This will give you a tool menu that you can dock within Unity. Examples of that exists in this format here and this format here. And you can switch between text and icon format by right-clicking on anywhere in the gray. I think by default you get the text version. We're going to use the icon version just because it's a little bit, I don't know, more easy on the eyes, I guess. So yeah, just be aware of that. In the workshops we use the icon format, not the text format. You also get another little toolbar, which is this one here, that you actually have in your, I believe, your game view. Yeah, no, scene view, sorry. And that contains the object, vertex, edge, and face modes that you switch between. So because you're manipulating geometry, you manipulate geometry in different ways, specifically vertex, edge, and face. We need to switch between them to get access to the tools that enable us to do more. So yes, keep that in mind, that if you're looking for a tool and saying, this tool doesn't exist, this workshop is, you know, it's not accurate, you might be in the wrong edit mode. Switch to the correct edit mode. And typically we'll mention what that edit mode is, but later on we'll just say, look, do this. So keep that in mind. Some of the basics of ProBuilder: object creation. So you can create simple to moderately complex what is called auto shapes, and this is a list of those auto shapes that you can create. You do need to, I think, kind of right click on the tool to get this to appear. So if you are by default just making the cube over and over again and you're not getting the option to create auto shapes, right click on, it's like a little dialog in the icon or in the text mode to get access to what's called the shape selector. And as you can see, those shapes are a lot more, well, some of them are a lot more complicated than the default shapes that you can make in Unity. So they could be a really good starting point for something more complicated. For example, if you need to make a tunnel, you'd probably start with something like a pipe, right? You want something that's hollow. You don't get this object by default in Unity. Well, now you do with ProBuilder, so that gives you a good starting point. You can increase the resolution of these with some settings below. Unfortunately, this is being clipped out because I'm showing you the list of tools, but it's pretty good. You can create, you know, what's a good example? An archway that has more than 5 elements to it. So you can make something with good geometric detail to begin with. So this is good to use for bases for more complex objects. You don't necessarily need to start from a cube from scratch every single time. If you know that the general shape of your object is going to look anything more similar to any of these, start with that. Don't start with a cube, because starting from a cube is a lot of work. Yeah, just think about what these could be applied to in the future. And obviously some of them are obvious, like a stair. If you're making a staircase, make the staircase object. Don't start from a cube. That's going to take you ages. So these objects contain generated object data with mesh and collider information. When you create them, you'll notice that in the component view window, that's just the default, you know, component view in Unity, there's a little bit more information. We get a new mesh component that gets created. It has a different material from the default texture, but that's just what it is. It's called ProBuilder default material or texture or something like that. You also get this script that gets added to it that allows you to essentially deform the mesh more. So that's where all of that is happening. That's connected directly to ProBuilder's, I guess, engine. And you'll see that within the actual mesh collider component, we have that mesh that we were talking about just before. So the mesh of the object that you're actually manipulating becomes the mesh of the thing, meaning that unless you apply a different collider to this object, that's going to be the object's collision, which is really convenient because we don't need to manipulate colliders afterwards. You just make the object and it should hopefully work. Unless you turn on rigid body static settings and all that. I don't recommend that. Just if you're going for pure level design, you shouldn't need to do any of those things. We also have what's called the poly tool, and this is also a good point to start with something that's not a typical object to begin with. You can actually create what's called your own custom object to some extent. So what the idea is that you draw this to a two-dimensional surface, such as the ground. So you can only start with one, I guess, face or side of this object you have in mind in question, and you extrude it upwards. And I'll describe to you what extrusion is in a bit. But you pull it upwards, and from there, you have the capacity to, do whatever the heck you want with it. So once again, it's limited to initial 2D ground plane construction. So you only have the one draw chance. After that, it becomes just a normal object that you manipulate. Hopefully that makes sense. If you play around with the tool enough, you'll figure out what the heck's going on. What's interesting about the poly tool and the objects that you make with it is just say you create an object that has a few too many initial vertices. Just say we went inwards here and then back to there, and then we decided that we'll lock that in. If we start extruding upwards and we're just like, wait, I didn't want that inner bit there, you can actually press Ctrl Z in that phase and remove that bit of geometry. So you don't need to start from scratch. If you screwed up this initial drawing phase and you want less detail, you can go back and pull that detail straight off the mesh, which is kind of amazing, to be honest. As well as you can press Ctrl Z during the actual drawing phase as well. So poly tool is quite useful for setting something up, and also has some, I guess, foolproof measures for actually making the object that you want without having to start from scratch every single time. So definitely have a play around with that. We will get you to do that in the workshop too. Yeah. don't start from a cube every single time, I guess is the moral of the story. Try and use something else if it makes life a little bit easier for you. Now, this is one that we won't necessarily make too much use of, but sometimes there's an object that you want to create and it's way too much effort to make it from scratch. You have the option to ProBuilderize an object that you have. Now, I am hesitant to continuously recommend this one because it does allow students to, yeah, I'll just say it, cheat. You could import geometry from another tool that's already complicated and then ProBuilderize it. What I'm going to tell you is that it's really easy to see if you've ProBuilderized something. And that's something we're going to be looking at if your geometry looks a little bit more detailed than we expected. So be very careful with this tool. You are allowed to use it, just be careful because we know how to check if you've been ProBuilderizing things that you probably shouldn't have been. And there will be some penalties to that. Let's go with that. But the idea is that you just take an object that is auto-generated, that has its own mesh. Good example is just a capsule. You can turn that into a ProBuilder equivalent with most of the settings. Some of them become unavailable when you do transfer between a standard Unity game object and a ProBuilder game object. The other thing is it is actually already unsuitable for complex objects. So if you are trying to aim for something with high geometry, it might, I wouldn't say crash it, but you're going to get issues. You're going to get faces that are flipped and the ProBuilderizing process may go wrong and you may not get what you want anyway. So you shouldn't be, but don't use it for complex objects. Again, something like a chandelier, if for whatever reason you decided you want to turn this into your level for whatever reason, and you press ProBuilderize on an asset that you've imported, you might have it explode and you can't use it that way because it's not foolproof. ProBuilderize won't always do the thing that you want, and you shouldn't be using it for something like that anyway. Obviously, it's not recommended on static objects as well. Sorry, on non-static objects. So yeah, anything that is moving around the scene, you shouldn't be ProBuilderizing that anyway. So yeah. Okay, let's quickly go through some of the ProBuilder tools. Let's start with the one that you're definitely going to be using the most, probably 90% of your exploration with ProBuilder. It's called Extrusion. Now this is a face edit mode tool. The idea being that you take one of the faces and you basically pull it outwards in the direction that it's facing. That, at its simplest description, describes what extrusion is. We're pulling a face, we're pulling it outwards, but we're not pulling necessarily that face. We're creating an additional set of geometry that just allows us to pull a clone of that face, essentially, outwards, so that we have more geometry to work with. And best way to describe it is that is the object in question initially. That's what it looks like after extrusion. You'll see that it's added all these other faces around it as well, which we can then also use to extrude, because at this point there is an edge, and that edge is retained at that point. So in the second screenshot, that edge still exists there. It's not over here, because if we did that, then the geometry would actually get morphed. So it actually recreates edges and faces, and to a lesser extent vertices, for your manipulation later on. So extrusion is amazing. Extrusion will be the thing that you mostly do in this unit, to be perfectly honest with you. And having said that, it is the cornerstone for primary geometric creation and geometric manipulation. If you've used any other 3D modeling program, you will know this to be mostly true. You do a lot of extrusion if you're manipulating something, low-level geometry based. So you will do the vast majority of your level designs using this technique. Don't be surprised if this comprises 90% of assignment 1 and a good chunk of assignment 3 as well. Extrusion, use it, get used to it. Another good one, and I'll just jump ahead and say that we're only mentioning the super important ones in this lecture. Some of the other ones are a little bit more nuanced. You don't need to use them all that often, or you can like do something else that does the same thing. But these ones are quite unique in the sense that if you do want to do something like, in this case, collapse vertices to a point being the keyword, you want to make a pointy object, then you do something like collapse vertices. So this is a vertex edit mode tool. You will not find it in the same mode as, what was the other one, a face edit mode tool. So again, that little toolbar at the top, you need to pick the right mode to get access to this tool. This is a reduction tool. You actually take all the vertices and they'll be collapsed to a central point, as in they will no longer exist. They'll all be replaced with a single vertex that's, I mean, typically it's the center of all of those points. Sometimes that can go a little bit weird if the points that you're trying to collapse are all over the place. Particularly if they're clipping each other, you have to be kind of careful that you don't pick up a vertex behind the ones that you've selected. This just requires some practice with the tool. But the idea is if you need to make a point, you collapse vertices. And you can imagine that, just say we weren't selecting all 4 of these vertices, we just had these 2. If we collapsed these 2, it would be that these 2 would retain and our pointy edge, so to speak, would be here instead. So you don't need to collapse the amount of vertices that we have in this screenshot. You can start doing whatever you want. And what you'd end up with would be a triangular face facing us here, which could be interesting because that could be a, I don't know, I mean, it depends on what you're making, but you could make something interesting from that technique too. So it's a really good way to reduce the amount of geometry that you're using so that you end up with something that you can then extrude from in a more interesting manner. Some good uses: points, edges, or just reducing geometric detail in general. Do note that not all vertices can be collapsed. Again, if you select vertices that would essentially destroy the object or flip it inside out, possibly because you've picked a vertex that's behind the object, you'll either get a warning in Unity, or if it does let you, it'll just look ridiculous and you know you've done something wrong. So I probably should have a warning on this tool. Be very careful when you start collapsing vertices, because if you do accidentally collapse a vertex alongside the ones that you do have, it may screw up your object and you may not realize that until you come back to it. And going back from that stage, if you've done anything else after it, that's a little bit of a problem. You'd actually need to start generating detail, geometry again from that point, and I wouldn't do that. Just make sure you don't screw up. Okay, mirror and cloning. These are slightly different tools, but they're actually put into the same tool. Yeah. This is an object edit mode tool. Now, what this is it could be described first and foremost as a duplication tool, because that's probably what you do with it most. But it's also useful to flip geometry without flipping the object's center in world space. So just say you have something that's centered 0, 0, 0 on the world, and just for the sake of ease, 0, 0, 0 on rotation. And you wanted to move that geometry so that it's 90 degrees rotated to the right, but you don't want it to actually rotate in world space. You still want to retain 0, 0, 0 rotation, right? You can use this tool to achieve that. You can rotate it slightly, or 90 degrees, let's say, on one of those axes. The other interesting thing about it is that you can duplicate. You can press duplicate, and it'll make a clone of it as well. In fact, you can combine these two settings so that you can not only flip it, but also duplicate it. So you can have two things that you can have one thing facing another thing, but they're flipped on the axis that you have set up instead. Now that's really powerful, because it means that not only do you need to not create the geometry that you're using in question, but you can actually have it flipped and face perfectly the other way, so that you can have two things looking at each other, for example. I didn't do any of what I just described, I just simply made a duplicate item and moved it slightly. But the idea here is that this is not for creating individual duplicates of objects. I mean, you could just clone an object if you wanted to do that. But if you need an object that has copies of its own geometry within the object itself, let's say something that requires a bit of symmetry, it's useful for that. And I'll give you a few examples of that in a few slides from now. But yeah, don't underestimate this tool, because it could save you a lot of work if you need to create something that has the exact same repeating pattern throughout its geometric setup. So you can also combine objects. Just say that these two objects that we created here, oh yeah, they are separate. So we did create a separate object with the mirror and cloning tool, but just say we wanted to actually for them to be the same object. Because at the end of the day, we just want to move them all together. We don't want them as actually separate things. Good way of setting this up is just to combine them. Now that's exactly what it sounds like. They just become the same object. All of the geometry gets merged together. Meaning that they all have a shared pool of vertices, faces, and edges. So if you start texturing this object, textures can be applied to both, which is a good way of making sure that an object has the exact same texture pool. And you just select the objects and merge them together. Usually this tool works fine. What I will mention here is that when you do merge objects, I don't think that this tool takes the center of the position between the two objects as the new pivot point between them. The pivot point of the merge object. So we're going to address that in the next tool that we described. But what I will say is that that's a problem. Not having a new pivot point established for merged objects means that we need to set that up. We need to actually recreate a new one, because when we combine objects, we obviously, for example, we probably don't want the pivot point to be here. This was the pivot point for this object, but when we combine them, it remains the pivot point for both objects, and maybe we want it to be in the middle. So keep that in mind. It has its limitations, but we have ways of fixing that. For example, we can centralize a pivot point. Now this is only one technique of doing this. You can, I think, literally set up a separate pivot point and then bake that pivot point to the geometry. I don't describe how to do that here because it's a little bit more convoluted. But if you did need to set up a new pivot point, the best, probably easiest way is to take all of your geometry, put it literally around the origin of the world, which is 0, 0, 0. Meaning that this point, the origin, is your new pivot point. And wherever you have positioned the geometry around the pivot point is where it's going to be the center. That's where it's all going to rotate around itself in this case. So you position the geometry around the origin and you freeze transform. So this is useful for resetting the pivot point and an object you may have edited. I mean, I guess one way of allowing this process to be easy and straightforward is maybe don't have anything on your origin of the levels that you start with, because if you start trying to do this with stuff in the way, it gets a little bit more complicated. But yeah, this is a nice simple way of recentering the center of objects that you have started to combine, or even just something that you've extruded beyond, say, the point of sensibility in a particular axis. The pivot point there doesn't necessarily get reset either. So once again, grab that object, put it on the point of origin in the manner that you want, and freeze its transform. It'll reset the pivot point to that point. So super useful tool. So a tool that we'll be using in later weeks, we won't be exploring this one this week, texture mapping. This is a face edit mode tool. For this tool to work, you actually need some materials set up outside of this tool. So if you can't find the PNG or JPEG files that you have imported, yeah, it's because they're not materials yet. So you need to actually make materials with those textures before they will be selectable here. But once you have set them up, you'll notice you'll have it's called the Material Editor tab. You have a pool of textures that you can select. And to actually place them on a bit of geometry and differentiate between the two, you actually use Alt 1, Alt 2, Alt 3, etc. So there are limitations to this, like an individual material editor on an object can only at maximum have 10 textures. I don't think you'll be going beyond that. And I think there is even a way to increase that, so maybe that is not the official limitation there. But this is a nice, easy way of applying multiple textures to a single object, which by default you cannot do in Unity. Now, the process of this actually gets you to perform what's called UV wrapping. When you start doing this, I can't remember if this is a separate tool. I don't know where this appears. I'll come back to that one. You can actually move the textures around to align them properly. And this is important when you start having edges that don't line up correctly. Say if you have something like a triangular edge intersecting with a flush square edge, and you want that texture to be slightly more angled in a specific direction, you can rotate it, you can scale it even, so you can make the actual texture appear bigger. You can fix it. I guess the simplest way of describing the usefulness of this tool is that you can fix textures that are out of whack, which will happen because ProBuilder isn't perfect. It doesn't know how to align everything, so you can fix them carefully with this tool by UV wrapping them. And once again, I should stress that this part of the tool, the texture mapping tool, allows you to have multiple textures applied without even leaving Unity, which is something that, if you are familiar with other 3D modeling programs, you've typically been doing up until this point. If you've had an object that requires, I don't know, let's say 2 textures like this, you have to take it into Blender, you have to UV wrap it, you have to export it with all that information attached. It's a pain in the ass, right? This allows you to do it within Unity in just a few clicks. So much simpler. We're definitely using ProBuilder for this reason. Yeah, it's one of the better, more interesting features of the tool, to be honest. So, quick activity. Again, I would have run this in class and it would have been a really nice discussion to have. I mean, if you're watching this online, feel free to have a chat with other people about this activity in Discord. That would be a useful go-between. But yeah, what kind of tools could we make using just the things that we just talked about? So to reiterate, we talked about extrusion, collapsing vertices, mirror clone object, combine object, and centralize pivot point. Just with that alone, you can make some really interesting stuff. The example that I came up with was you could totally make a picket fence. A picket fence will consist of some basic extrusion, a little tiny bit of collapsing vertices, but once you have obtained that, essentially that bit of geometry for one picket, you would clone it, combine them all, and possibly recenter that object so that you can move this part of the object around. So have a think about what else you could create there. Obviously, objects that look a lot like this are best, but if there's anything else you have in mind, let us know, because there are probably some things that I have not even thought of that you could create just from these tools alone. So yeah, have a think about that. Okay, so there are much more tools that we will explore using ProBuilder. We'll mostly do this in the workshops following this week's workshop, but every now and then I will bring one up in a lecture if it is critical that you understand what it is that we're doing, or maybe just to describe the process a little bit better. Sometimes the workshops are a little bit blunt because they need to be short and self-contained. I might talk about a technique in a little bit more detail in the lecture. What I guess I'm trying to say is that you should come to both the lectures and the workshops because you learn how to do things in both, and there's lots of carry over between the two in this unit. So this is just a surface level introduction. We will eventually explore other techniques such as, let's say, custom pivot points for something like a door. Again, this idea of setting up a separate pivot point and using that to specifically allow rotation on a dynamic object, such as a door. Subdivision, or the idea of taking geometry and increasing the amount of resolution on a surface so that we can do whatever the heck we need to do there. Typically, you just take a face and start dividing it up even more. Carving, or specifically using an object to pull geometry away from another object. That's a really interesting process, mostly because you can achieve some, I guess, more complicated patterns with very little work using carving. You are carving, like a piece of geometry. Weld vertices. Sometimes you don't need to collapse vertices, you need to join them at the hip so that two separate game objects become one directly, as in they're directly joined. So you're literally welding the corners of them together. And you don't want to do that incorrectly. You do want to do that with precision, because maybe you want to extrude off that surface as well. So you're not just going to just slam two bits of geometry together. You actually want to connect them at the hip. You want them to be joined. There's also a technique called the interior design style. I know some other places have different name for this, but the idea of it is that you design a level where the exterior normal is flipped on the surfaces, so that if you're looking into the level, you can see through the walls. But if you're inside the level, everything is textured normally. And you've probably seen this in some ways when you glitch through a wall in a AAA game. You'll notice that you can see through the whole level, or at least the part of the level that you were just in. That's because they've designed the level so that the normals are facing you, the player. This is typically the case for, say, first-person shooters. But outside, all the normals are, the surfaces on them are only one-sided. So we'll show you how to do that, because that's useful for creating a level that the player is contained within. Let's say something like, a dungeon or a tunnel. We'll also talk a little bit about hidden element editing, because there are some techniques for correctly manipulating objects by selecting stuff that you can't see as well. But that's getting a little bit more complicated. That's a few weeks away. So we will show you much more in the coming weeks specific to what you're doing in workshops. Once again, lectures will introduce it, workshops will show you how to actually do it. So come to both, otherwise you'll miss out on important information. Having said that though, if you would like to know more, check out the ProBuilder documentation in the meantime. You may find that there are similar techniques that can be employed in ProBuilder to that of other 3D modeling programs. Some of these we will get to. But the vast majority of stuff that you may find on the official website, we won't actually require you to do for IGB321, mostly because the kind of level design that we do just isn't super complicated. It's mostly just going to be consisting of the, 5 or 6 tools I just mentioned. So if you start going beyond that, that's good. Feel free to do that. Just keep in mind that you could probably still achieve it using the techniques that we will introduce you to, and there's no requirement for you to learn a super complicated way of manipulating geometry for this unit. So yeah, ProBuilder documentation, that's the link there. Check it out if you want to know more. Yeah, I'll leave that up to you. Now, I briefly hinted at this in last week's lecture, and this will be another topic that I just continually mention. There is a degree of geometric detail that we do expect for the assignments for this unit. For assignment 3, it's moderate to high. For assignment 1, it's low level, but that means something different for each student. For some students, low level means cube, and then another cube, and then that's my level. I mean, maybe not for all of you, but we want you to really go beyond this concept of just using cubes for your whiteboxing process. That's entering below low level geometry, because it doesn't really describe what we're looking at the end of the day. It's suitable for white boxing, which is what we get you to do this week, but beyond that, you need to do a little bit more. Mostly because we're doing white boxing in week 2. If you submit your white box level as your final assignment, well, let's just say your marks won't be super great. So a good comparison here, and I know I have a massive cross in front of this part, but you can kind of get the idea that this is way too simple for what we expect for assignment 1. However, if your level is looking something like this, that's great. You actually probably don't even go beyond this. This is perfect. You're hitting the nail on the head. However, if your level is looking more like that, you need to do a little bit more. And a lot of that can be fixed through some degree of lighting, a little bit of texture work, but probably the best thing for you is just going to be adding slightly more complicated geometry to your scene. So, I mean, at the end of the day, if you are a bit confused about this, just check with your tutors to see if you're on the right track. We'll tell you pretty much straight up, like, look, this just needs to look better. There needs to be slightly more detail here. I don't know what I'm looking at. Is that supposed to be a stairwell? Because it's just a cube. It is a stairwell. Okay, make it look like a stairwell. That kind of thing. Which is fine for white boxing, but not fine for a prototype level submission. Now I bring this up because some students in the past have submitted some very, very low level geometry levels, and we do have to mark them down just because, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a low effort submission. We want you to do better. We want you to get good marks for this unit, so yes, geometric detail expectation. With regards to white boxing, let me give you the definition of that. I mean, I think I've talked about this a number of times now, but essentially the idea is that we set up a basic level or levels geometry using blocks and block-like objects, and because of the default texture in the game engine that you're using, in this case Unity, but even in something like Unreal Engine, it's typically white or grey or somewhere between the two, so we either call it white boxing or grey boxing. But the idea is you set up the basic geometry of the level to get an idea of how it scales, how it looks, how it feels. How light is thrown around the level would be another good example of using white boxing. So you will utilize your top-down diagram for the basic layout of your white boxing technique, which we will start this week. But we will move beyond it quite quickly, because once you set that up, then now it's time to start manipulating that geometry further. So your white box level will be placeholder. Don't think that's the end. It's not for assignment 1. You will learn new techniques to replace these parts, such as, let's say, a block is actually supposed to be an archway. It's actually supposed to have a gap in between it. So we'll show you how to do that. Let's just say this wall is supposed to actually be a wall with windows. We'll show you how to do that too. And some of you are probably thinking, like, wouldn't it just be easier to just make that bit of geometry? Yes. If you're confident you can do those things quickly during your white boxing stage, mostly because you know, hey, if I make this one time, I can just repeat it, right? That's true. If you're confident that you can make such things like an archway, a window, instead of just white boxing things straight off the bat, quickly, I might add, then feel free to do so, because you're just going to duplicate that geometry and reuse it throughout your scene, which is actually part of the point of assignment 3, but we will talk about that in weeks to come. However, if you were thinking along those lines, then good for you. That is the correct way to think about level design. So yeah, this week, ProBuilder, white boxing, yeah. Some clarifications regarding Overwatch. So some of you have asked some of the characters in Overwatch, they can actually go quite high. Do we need to accommodate for said characters in Overwatch? Ideally, yes. Keep in mind that some of them can go higher than others, and you can always decide that, look, there's a maximum height here. You can have, I wouldn't call it an invisible wall at the top, but you can cap it and say that, look, Farah unfortunately can't go flying into heaven in this level, there is a roof. So here is a roof. And maybe that's just an invisible collider for the purpose of your prototype level. Again, it's not complete. You don't actually need to push that roof into your level and completely occlude everything. But the short answer of it is yes, your maps should aim to accommodate all vanilla Overwatch heroes and their mechanics. So why I say vanilla is that it's best to just aim for vanilla characters, because a lot of the videos you might watch about characters have obviously moved beyond that. If you're trying to make a level that fully accommodates, I can't even remember the name of the hamster, whatever his name is, that might be a problem because he can get all around levels. So let's not focus on those ones. Let's focus on the vanilla, as in release cast, the characters that were released with the game when it first came out, and that should be sufficient. Others have noticed that there are multiple pathways in Overwatch maps. Yes, that is very true. Overwatch borrows what's called the 3-lane rule for the most part, except when you get to like primary choke points. But we will explore this concept, but just keep in mind that yes, there are multiple pathways in Overwatch. Depending on the kind of map that you're designing, say a capture point, you probably want to accommodate for that, as in have multiple ways of accessing this point. I know I've had a chat with some of my guys in 9 to 11 on Tuesday about how they can do this effectively, because it's probably more important for the attackers than it is for the defenders, because the defenders, well, they get to a static position and they defend, whereas the attackers need to attack said position from multiple vectors. That's where the multiple pathways primarily comes into play. In terms of a borrowed theme, some of you are saying that, look, I really like Hanamura's theme. Can I build off that? That seems amazing. I would like to explore that territory, download textures similar to that. I love the Japanese, futuristic theme there. Can I just do that? Yeah, you can. We're not telling you what to do with the thematic design of your level. You can go nuts with whatever you choose there. I would highly encourage you to maybe even borrow one of the existing themes in Overwatch, because it just means that it's going to fit into that universe even better. But you're not restricted to that. Obviously, feel free to do whatever you want here, providing it's sensible and still applicable to the game. With that in mind, though, if you're going to ask the question, well, then can I get all the textures and lighting data and whatnot from Overwatch? We don't have access to that. You're going to have to go and find your own resources to accommodate a borrowed theme, but feel free to borrow a theme from Overwatch. I mean, even taking this screenshot here into consideration, if you want to borrow this theme, there are some very industrial looking textures. A lot of it is set out in the outdoor world. Yeah, I mean, that's a starting point. Feel free to start using these ideas and borrow them, transfer them over to your potential level design. That would be fine. Go nuts. However, having said all that, and again, I will mention this every time, every opportunity, you are not implementing Overwatch gameplay mechanics. Understand there is a difference between the level design of Overwatch and the gameplay mechanics that level is accommodating. You're not implementing those gameplay mechanics, but we are accommodating them. So, you don't need to implement them. You do not need to make a weapon. You do not need to make a character for Overwatch. Please don't go down that route. Even if you're trying to troll your tutors by, doing that for some reason, it's just going to be a waste of time. You're not going to get any marks for it at all. Heck, we might even get slightly annoyed and, well, I won't say what we'll do then. Just don't do it. It's a waste of time. Accommodate the gameplay mechanics. Don't implement them. We're going to continue exploring Overwatch. So in the coming weeks, we will be exploring Overwatch mechanics, gameplay, and strategies. A lot of this will be in the form of videos from the Overwatch team, because there is a huge library of content that they've released over the years related to their level design, their gameplay design, prior to even them getting started what they were working on. Some of you might know that Overwatch actually wasn't the game that they had in mind early on. It was going to be something very different, and how that game then turned into Overwatch because of internal, I guess, issues with the game's development at the time. So we're going to be doing more Overwatch exploration. It has not stopped. Week 1 wasn't the only opportunity for you to do that with your peers. However, you are strongly encouraged to do your own exploration and research, especially in these early stages. And some of you have actually been putting stuff on Discord, as I mentioned before. That's fantastic. If you find something that's amazing, I mean, once again, there's so much of it that we won't be covering all of it in lectures. Hopefully you don't post a video that we're actually going to use, but feel free to put a video up or two if you do find something interesting. I might mention that, look, we're going to watch this video in the lecture if someone does happen to do that, just to kind of reserve it, so to speak. So if your post disappears in that case, it's not because it was disapproved of, unless it was, of course. There will also be some additional materials getting released as time goes on. Some of these you should watch whenever you have the spare time. Some of these will be related to Overwatch as well as the ones that we will eventually watch will all end up in that folder too. So if you do miss out for whatever reason, say in the lecture, you can find that material directly linked there too. So keep your eye on that folder. Lots of stuff will be going into it over time. Okay, that is today's lecture. It's a little bit shorter than what was planned. Again, because of the changes in format, there's some stuff that I don't need to do, so yeah, it's a little bit shorter this week. Next week's lecture is going to be about formal elements and world building as, again, a greater discussion of competitive FPS level design, i.e. Overwatch in this case. We'll also talk about other levels as well, such as, I think we'll talk briefly about Counter-Strike. Actually, something I should mention there is a student brought up as saying that there's a really strong focus on this competitive FPS level design so far in this unit. We do walk away from that too. So if you're wondering, hey, what about levels in, MMOs and adventure games or something like The Witcher? Yeah, we will get to that. Don't worry too much. We're just using this as an introductory content to the unit because it's quite dense and well contained. It gives a good taste for where we move in the unit, as well as using ProBuilder as a tool. This kind of level design is very straightforward. But we do move beyond this. That's not what this unit is completely about. We do explore other domains. This week's workshop, ProBuilder Basics, Whiteboxing. You should know what I'm talking about at this point. Keep in mind that Assignment 1 Part A is going to be marked in this week's workshop, so rock up to your allocated workshop unless, once again, you are from the Monday practical, where you have the option to rock up to any of the 3. So ensure that you've also finished workshop content from the previous week because that's what's going to be marked for the most part. There are some steps that you do need to focus on, but yeah. And this is your final warning. These activities are marked in or before the workshops and no later. So if you miss out, that's it. You've missed 2% of the grade. Sorry, we tried to give you the information as best we could. If you've got to this point and somehow you have not watched either of these 2 lectures or the 2 workshops or looked at the CRA, I don't know what to tell you. You need to do a better job at looking at your university content that you're paying for. So yeah, sorry about that, but that's it. Final warning. If you do have any questions, please either send them to me directly via my email address. I didn't put it here, but you can find it in the week 1 lecture, as well as any questions on Discord. Other than that, I hope you all have a good day. Do remember that we are in lockdown at the moment, so you should just be doing stuff at home, hopefully. Alright, I'll catch you guys tomorrow, as well as your other tutors too. Catch you later.